scene. This, for those astute observers, is going to be one of our new default templates that we're going to be providing new users to replace our existing default template. So to give you a bit of a basic overview of the scene before I start color grading it and talking about color theory and all the rest of it, I'll just quickly browse around. It's a fairly simplistic enclosed scene, and I'll talk a little bit about the setup of the actual lighting itself before we begin to change it. So the bulk of this scene is actually relying heavily on enlightenment-based lighting. That means that because we're using the real-time mode, we're actually able to see some of the color changes that I make throwing through the baking process in real time. That is to say, as I modify, for instance, the directional light in here, all the other little lights will, all the random bits around the scene will update in accordingly. They'll update a little bit slower, but it means you do get the effect of being able to witness the changes to the light in terms of baked lighting effects. So as you can see here, where it's not directly lit, you still will see some modifications in the color as the light bounces around the scene. So this means we get a more accurate view of the final picture after we've baked the lighting if we've been using the mixed lighting, but it also means that we're able to get a little bit more quality out of it as well. So the scene itself, pretty straightforward. There's a handful of lights in here. If I go in the search and the hierarchy, I can just use T and then the colon symbol and then light. There's one word, which might be a little bit hard to see there. This actually shows all the lights in the scene. So the T colon stands for type. So you just look for everything that's got a type light attached to it. So today what I want to cover off is, first I want to cover use of the post stack v2. That is because while I have done masterclasses on the post stack before, we have since upgraded the post stack to a new version, and there's a lot of nifty new features associated with it, including volumes. Volume support was available before, but it was quite primitive. The new volume support is far more sophisticated and allows for nice blending. This can also be animated, which I plan to show as well today. The second thing I want to show off today is specifically looking at ways we can influence color besides grading, and we actually probably will go back to grading after I've done sort of a quick introduction of it. And then we'll also be looking at special effects that we can attach to a scene that can improve the overall control you have over the mood and atmosphere in the particular scene. That's going to be influencing things such as fog, for example, as well as volumetric lighting options that are available in the Sinespace SDK. Finally, the last thing that I was going to cover, and that was quite important, and it has slipped my mind. Let's get on with it and I'll remember what it was. I did actually plan this lesson out already. So, I'm going to start with some basic color theory. So, in the Western tradition of film and media, there is colors associated with particular purposes. So, for example, red is associated with passion. That could be violence, so that could be love. You have purple. Purple is associated with usually some kind of exoticism. It's particularly the deep bluey purples. But it can also be associated with fantasy, all sorts of things. We have the pastels, so that's the light pinks, the light blues. Those ones tend to be associated with childhood, they're innocent, those kinds of colors come in. We have yellow, more like madness. We have green, which is traditionally associated with weirdness and otherworldliness, it can also be associated with evil, depending on the color grades. We have all these sort of effects that filmmakers like to use when producing films, and that has started to leak into the game industry over the last couple of years as the ability to do post-grading and so forth has become widespread in the game industry. The game industry has started picking up many of these things as well. So what we're going to look at today is particularly how we can influence this scene, how we can make it look all sorts of different themes by just manipulating the lighting. My goal today is actually to avoid touching the content at all. I don't want to do anything other than add, remove, or change the light sources in the scene and the actual overall settings on the scene itself. So, let's start with something basic. We want to convert this scene into a horror scene. I mean, right now, it's pretty modern and futuristic, but we could tint this in particular ways that actually sort of evoke those themes. So, I'm going to first start by setting up my post stack for general use. I'll just show you the setup of my camera because I'm using a preview camera rather than just hitting into play mode all the time, just because this will be faster. So in order to get real-time previewing of your lighting changes, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a camera. So you just create a camera in the scene. That's File, Create Camera. And then what I have got attached to this one is I've left these settings all the same. I've attached a post-process layer to it. I've attached a volumetric light renderer, because we'll use that later. And finally, I've attached an audio listener. Now, you do not need to create the camera normally when working in Sinespace, because we create the cameras for you. However, for the fact we want to do fast previewing today, setting up a camera like this is important. There is only one important change that I've made here, and that is that I have set the layer here on the volume blending to transparent effects. That is quite important. That actually indicates which layers we receive post volumes from. In the case of the Sinespace viewer, this is hard-coded to transparent effects. It is required that all your post volumes live on this layer. If you do not, then the main camera will not pick them up. If you put post volumes on other layers and you've got specialty cameras in the scene that serve a particular purpose, then by all means, don't use other layers as you wish. But if you want the main camera, the one that we provide in Sinespace, to pick it up, transparent effects needs to be set there. Other things I've got deferred fog enabled in the post layer. I also have high quality SMAA anti-aliasing here. Some of the other options do give better or worse effects. However, the SMAA is the one we typically use inside Sinespace. I will note the word typical, because on different platforms we may change this to different anti-aliasing depending on the performance requirements, such as on lower end machines we'll actually switch to FXAA instead of SMAA because it runs faster. With that all being said, the last one we've got here is the volumetric light renderer. I've set the resolution here to full. That is what the client runs at. We do use the full setting. There is some advantages in performance for going down to 1/2 and 1/4 resolution. However, it also leads to light bleeding effects, and we would prefer that users just simply toggle the volumetric light on and off on their settings window and take or lose the performance penalty, rather than suffer those light bleeding effects on the people who do have machines powerful enough to run it at full specs. Okay, so we've got all those bits and pieces in here. The next thing we're going to do is just going to give you an overview of the post zone. So in previous classes, we've created new objects and we've added the post zone component to it. Now, in the very first release, we had all these various toggles and things that you could play with. Then we moved towards using the post-stack V1, our variant of it, which you can select profiles. V2 is fairly similar, except that this component comes from Unity themselves, so it's a built-in ongoing supported thing from Unity. It means that people are actually distributing pre-made effect packs and things on the asset store. In our particular case, we have got the post-process volume. Now, because we want one post-process volume to cover the whole scene when you're not inside another volume, we have the is global ticked. And then finally, we have a profile in here. Now, a profile works the same as it does before. You just need to create a post-stack profile. And I need to remember which one it is, because unfortunately, it's all confusingly named exactly the same. Let me just quickly, post-process profile, I think is the one. So, one of these two. If it works, it'll get that little pretty icon. I'm just going to create this one. We will probably strip out the old profiles from the editor packs going forward at some point in the future. Yes, okay, so that was the right one. So, a post profile volume in Unity now, instead of having a preset list of effects that you can toggle, you actually have to add the effects one by one. I've also inputted a second pack of extensions, which we may or may not go into. These are supported in new versions of the Sinespace viewer. However, we haven't sort of officially added that to the extension list yet. So the basic effects we've got here, we've got ambient occlusion, automatic exposure, bloom, chromatic aberration, color grading, depth of field, grain, lens distortion, motion blur, screen space reflections, and vignetting. That particular list of effects has not changed from the previous version. There is no new effects being added here. However, there has been some significant changes in how they work. So, since we're going on color, the first one I'll do is the color grading. Now, as you remember, there was previously a window that looked fairly similar to this one. The main difference in the V2 versus the V1 is that the V2 allows you to remain in HDR color throughout rendering. And that means that for those people who have very fancy high definition range monitors, such as HDR 400 and above, graded monitors and TVs and so forth connected to their viewer, then as long as their graphics card supports it, you can actually remain in HDR pixels. This means we can actually get some greater pop and vibrancy on those displays. That is not completely commonplace yet. However, in the next couple of years, it certainly will be. So if you're thinking about things being built for 1 to 2 years from now, just keep in mind that new monitors do support HDR, and as people begin to replace their hardware over the sort of the normal 5-year cycle, it will become more commonplace. Some laptops have it, some laptops don't. Laptops tend to be a bit of a laggard as far as nice monitors go. However, that's there. as per before, we do have the ability to do the same curves as before. However, now as I said here, we've got the option to go to HDR range mode and not HDR range mode. Now, unfortunately, some of the effects that we may want to play with are locked to the HDR, to the LDR mode. As you see here, when you change these things, some of the settings will change. We also gain the ability to use the red, green, and blue curves directly. That is a little bit disappointing because the red, green, blue curves were a convenient way of doing particular types of grading effects. However, unfortunately, they are limited to the LDR renderer. Now, the upside is when you switch to the HDR renderer, we do get better tone mapping support is available here. So, for instance, we can start flipping between. Well, actually, let me set this up as our test masterclass profile. I'll just hop this into the scene so as we fiddle with these settings, we can see them. One of the things you'll also note is that you have a tick box next to every single property here. This actually means that it overrides, and that means that if you've got two post volumes that are both intersecting with each other, it will only override as long as the tick is there. If the override is not there, then it'll descend down to the previous lowest, or the previous post profile that did in fact adjust this particular parameter, and it will modify it. It'll use that value in particular. So if you, for instance, have one profile that has got red channel mixing here ticked and one that does blue, and you're inside both volumes, the one that is the higher priority will get the preference. However, because they're touching separate fields completely, they will override, well, not override, they will complement each other, and you'll get both sets of effect. One of the fastest ways to deal with this, if you want to completely override things, is just click this all button here. It's actually not very visible that it is a button, but the text all there, if you click it, it will automatically select everything. So you know that that will be the precise effect that is visible within that volume. This can be particularly useful for changing sort of certain settings in a particular area, but leaving the bulk of the scene alone. Say, for example, you want to walk into a room and you want the bloom to get massively brighter. However, you still want to leave the same tonal settings that you've got on your master scene. Then those will come through there. So that was a long introduction before we start messing around with things, but hopefully that's a good starting point. I'm going to duplicate my post zone here, and I'm going to create one that is, in fact, a higher priority. So I'm going to set this to 5. And I'm just going to drop my test profile into here. Now, you'll notice here it's picked up just the settings that I had and nothing more. So I'm going to set the mode to HDR. I'm going to set this to, for instance, ACES film coloring mode, or film grading. The ACES profile, I forget the exact origin of it, but it does have an origin in film and TV. And it does produce what I find is a much higher contrast effect. The neutral one is generally speaking better. It handles a wider variety of ultra bright and ultra dark surfaces, and that's not going to make much sense until I start actually adding some ultra bright and ultra dark settings, lights into here. So I'm going to start adding a spotlight in here just to show some of these color grading bits off. And I have a horrible feeling that even now that this is probably going to be a class that I need to repeat with more details. So I've got a really bright surface here. I mean, this is almost like the sun is directly hitting a bit, and you can see this is blooming well. So if I start beginning to play with this one and walk through the tone mapping, so no tone mapping, as you can see, it's sort of not giving you a lot of range. Everything's getting cut off. We're hitting the whites too early, and that means that it's overexposed and we're not getting a lot of useful output. The neutral one, as you can see, it's actually what it's doing when it color grades here is it's actually softening the edges. So the blacks are a little bit harder to hit, the whites are a little bit harder to hit, but the neutral ranges are sort of more exposed, and that means you've got a bit more control over the exact specific way light can interact with the scene. Go to the ACES one. Again, you see the same thing. However, what it does is it darkens the low end of the curve quite a bit. Finally, we've got the option to create custom curves. You can actually produce both the other curves using this. It is, however, a little bit of trial and error to work out what you're going to get. But for instance, the toe strength here that's how much darkness we're going to introduce and how much it's going to force to darkness. We can change the length, whatever, to make really dark or not. The shoulder is the top. That's how much of the white. So by using that, we get that same effect as the neutral one. We can again adjust these shoulder lengths and so forth to get particular goals that we want to hit. also adjust the angles and so forth to overall brightness. These ones I'm not going to touch with too much today. I'm going to assume we're going to use the neutral and the ASUS ones for the bulk of what we're going to be doing. So I'm just going to switch all those back off. So I think I said that I wanted to get this looking, well, here we are, we instant got an example. I'm going to try and switch this to a sort of more evil horror theme to it in a minute, but just because I have got a good result here, I will talk a little bit about it. Bringing this into the golden colors, this is obviously making it a little more old. You can feel this has got warmth to it. It's a memory. You can play with all these settings. Likewise, cool values down here towards the blues, they tend to convey a sense of energy. They can also convey calmness depending on which blues you're using in particular. And they can also portray sort of sci-fi-ish things, particularly towards the more silvery notes. Now, I am going to go back to my goal of making this scene look evil. There's a couple of things that I want to worry about here. The first is that, generally speaking, you don't see too many horror films that are set in daylight. They tend to be set pretty dark because we have a primal fear of the dark. We also have a fear of not knowing where things are going, where things are. So the best ways to bring those notes into the scene is actually fog. So if I go into the window lighting panel, which I usually always have open somewhere, so I can go to the Windows lighting settings. So here on the lighting panel, I have a setting down the bottom called fog. And if I turn fog on, I've got the ability to, as you can see in the distance, some of these trees have been fogged out. So if we're going for this more dark and moody effect, what we might do is bring the start point in, because I'm using linear. There's a few modes here on fog. There's linear, exponential, and exponential square. That sort of just influences how quickly the fog appears in the scene. I find linear gives me the greatest control as an artist. It's not necessarily the most favored one, but it does give me good results. So I'm going to set this to 3 meters because we're going to get really close on our fog. And in fact, we can sort of start playing in the negatives, but I think I'll do it there. And I'm going to go with something a little bit less than black. I'm going to go with that brown there. Now, immediately we've got a problem with our skybox. Usually you want your skybox to match the fog for it to actually work well. This means that if you're going to be playing with fog, it works better with indoor scenes than outdoor scenes. However, I'm going to play with our skybox as well, because we're going to want to tint this down and get it to a little more dusk looking. It is worth noting that the Silent Hill game series actually used fog as a way of performance enhancement, because they could actually set the draw distances really low as a result of putting heavy fog in a scene. That is a technique that you can take advantage of as well. If you have a particularly high poly scene, you can use the original post zone to adjust the far and near clip values, and you can lower those down and get yourself some performance boosts. So this is the skybox. This is actually one of our skyboxes that's included in the editor pack. So I'm going to take with a tint. I'm going to tint it right down, and I'm probably going to play around with the exposure as well, just because we can do that. So this has got a little more blue into it than I'd like, so I might just go into the oranges and just try and match this up. This might take a little bit of work. There's some parameters like the atmosphere thickness you can play with to get these results, but as I said, we just want to play around with a lot of these settings to figure out exactly the result we want. Okay, and right, so we've got that one now sort of kind of matching our fog. Our fog is probably not close enough though, because we go into this hallway here and it's still very, very bright. So I'm going to start bringing these endpoints down. I'm going to set this down to 15. So this is now getting a little bit creepier. Something to also worry about is that transparent surfaces and fog don't play nice. This is an unfortunate reality of just the simple way they work. The glass panel shader, I don't know if I can do this. I'm trying to avoid touching the content, so we might just bring that fog a little bit back up, and I'll figure out some other ways that we can get those kinds of results. So this is still one way we might have avoid this. I'm just seeing because that does seem like it's a little bit worse than usual. There might be a secondary glass or something in there that we have to worry about. Let me just quickly check. Yes, me adjusting this seems to not have an impact. In fact, setting the transparency to 0 doesn't seem to influence it, so there is something going on there. It might actually come down. When we bake the reflection probes later. That will, if it. As I said, I'm just trying to avoid touching these surfaces because that would be cheating as far as I think goes. So we've got the first step here. The second step is our directional light. What ways can we make this look more evil with? So red's always a good way, so is darker colors in general. So now we're going to take our very bright light here out. Now I am going to do just a quick reflection probe bake, just because this will have some influence over some of these values that we're looking for previewing. And just give it a second. Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. The other thing to note is that the quality of our lighting has gone down as we started fiddling with this. This is because lighting does take a little bit of work to get looking good, but it also does rely on us having, for instance, some of these bakes and things in place before they do. So we've messed with a lot of the ambient settings. I think that I'll take the fog off and just have a look at the scene. I mean, may even be worth keeping this fog off and just poking around with some of these settings that we've got on our new post zone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start raising the contrast. That's probably another useful hint that there's something odd. So I'll just take that one in. Again, we've got getting some results here. The problem is this is a little bit too bright. So, I mean, this is obviously way too dark down there, but that's okay because we can actually hint the lighting a little bit as we go. So I'm just going to go to our tea lights. And these garage ceiling lights, I'm just going to bring them down to something that's a little bit wrong. In fact, I might even take those off. Looks like they're not even in use much. So the other thing that's worth noting is that this scene is using emissive surfaces. Emissive surfaces in the baked rendering system will actually emit light. So as you can see here, this is set to emit an ultra bright white. But if we bring this one down into the in fact, since we're going for horror, we might go something a little bit off color. Might just switch them off completely. Just be aware that, as I said, the baked reflections and things won't have much of an impact until we rebake those reflection probes. So our scene right now is getting a little bit creepier. It's not quite there yet. So I'm going to take this directional light and maybe just poke around with some of the colors and things involved a little bit. Obviously, I want to keep it dark. Now, the problem with this one is we've obviously darkened this down too much to be functional as a scene, but that's okay. One of the tricks that game developers use in particular for hinting things at players is to literally just light up the things that players should concentrate on. They may not even put a natural light source in there. The actual conveyance of reality here is not good. Now, as I've covered in previous classes, some colors we perceive better than others. Like, for instance, blues we're not particularly good at seeing, which means that deep deep blues that are dark, we can still see somewhat, but we don't perceive them as very bright. So here we go. We've now brightened up the place that you're supposed to come in. We might need to just place a bunch of these spotlights around the scene. That's okay to use those just for reference. Spotlights are cheap. They don't cost much to render, so you can go nuts with them within reason. So we've got a driveway down there. Might just add a little bit of color contrast there. But so if you played a game, you might actually begin to see some familiar or recent games. You might see some familiarities with what I'm doing. You'll notice that if I switch off this grid, which I think I can do here, there we go. As you can see here, we've lit up the area that's important, but we've actually broken lighting in general. But because humans aren't very good at perceiving what is and isn't true in terms of lighting and shadowing, we can actually get away with a lot. Your brain will actually ignore irregularities when it comes to shadows. Now, this road here is blocking off. Now, that's picking up some light off from the actual ambient skybox, which is a little bit annoying because that's something we don't want to have happen, because what we really want to have happen is we want you to turn around and just see nothing. And I think at ground level that's okay, but if we can cut off the player, that's better. So that's just something to think about. Maybe a particularly long fog might be a good solution to that particular problem. So we'll bring our fog back in, and I'm going to set that distance to I'll set this to 150. I'll set that to 50 so it doesn't clip in straight away, but maybe we bring this to 75. I'm going to set this down to black. Okay, so we've gone it from being a very colourful scene to quite a dark and brooding one. Let's say we want the user to go up the stairwell, then again we might consider doing things like lighting that, putting a light up here. So we just want to hint it. We don't want to go completely overboard, so what we might do is hint the window there. We might use a couple of lights to do that. Something you, again, to concern yourself with is the specular reflections on the floor. Those are a symptom of real-time lighting. If you switch this to a baked light, and I'm not going to be baking lights today just because it takes way too long sometimes. It's probably okay because I've got the Enlighten engine on, but it's just worth considering that they do sometimes take a while to bake. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that, and I'm just going to put shadows on as well, because the shadows from casting through the stairs are probably going to look quite nice. So again, we're sort of leading the player in one particular direction versus another. I might just increase these ranges a little bit. I just want to cover off the. So I'm just going to make sure what we're doing actually makes sense. And again, if you see lighting artifacts, like for instance the fact that we're highlighting the hallway a little bit too much, just be aware that a rebake can help with that as well. Okay, so here we are, we've led the player, and they're probably going to see that stairwell, or they might see the dark room. Now, I don't think most players head towards dark rooms. Games tend to have encouraged people to do particular things with particular lighting, particularly heading towards lighting as a common hint in games to let people know where they're actually supposed to go. The area that you're supposed to go is lit the best from where you are. And you can play with things like the color grading and so forth to actually bring people into particular spaces. So if we instead wanted to send people down this room, we would just simply make this particularly bright. So I'm going to potentially rebake this scene again, just so I can get rid of some of these false reflections that are throwing my sense of style out. So I'm just going to make the reflection probes. So while we're doing this, I'm going to look at other ways we might particularly make something bring in that effect. So I mentioned before that green particularly can look quite evil, particularly particle effects and so forth. Be aware that when you're using particle effects, they do support the lighting module, so consider using that when you're doing your work here. So here we go. Now we've got that nice and baked. We have our destination fairly well lit up. So if I take the camera, it's in the scene, and I look at it from various angles, like I'm just using the Control-Shift-F key to do stuff. If a player is here, they're probably going to head in here, and they'll probably have a look around at this. They'll see the dark corner, shy away from it, and head down this particular direction. Again, pretty straightforward stuff, and it's just sort of one of these useful things to have in your toolbox. If you're even not building dark and scary things, the same effects still apply. The brighter areas, the areas that the users are going to want to explore. All right, I'm going to bring my camera back to a semi-neutral pose. And we are going to reset a bit of the scene and go for some different effects. Sorry, I actually was going to go with slightly evil first. So something to consider playing with. We create particle systems. Let's throw under effects now, and they keep moving. As you can see here, we've got these lights. I believe these can, in fact, emit what was our lights settings? Lights. So they take a template light just for reference. So if I take that one as my template, I'm not 100% sure it will actually have an influence on. Oh, it will. That's quite a bright effect. I'm just going to create this one as our particle system light, just for the sake of it. I'm just going to push this light way down underground, so it doesn't actually influence anything. So it's to minus 100. It's a safe way of getting rid of it. I'll just put this light into our things. The ratio there indicates on how many lights there will be created per particle. At 1, it's going to create 1 light per particle. That's 50 particles right now with 50 light sources attached to it. And you can set the maximum there to control that. So if I take this particle system and I'm going to set the emission down to 4, I'm going to start playing with the colors a little bit. So I'm just going to create a random between two colors. I'll set this to that bright evil green. I might just set it a little bit. Now our point light here is way too far range, so I'm just going to set that down to 1. Maybe set that to 5 perhaps. I'll set the intensity down to 1. And our emission curve, I'm just going to play with this one a little bit. Shape isn't going to be a cone, but it's going to be a ray. As you can see here, there's something not quite right going on. And we can use all these various effects and influences to tell players that what's happening and what they should avoid, because these kinds of things they will naturally steer clear of, but they might investigate as well. It's sort of a mixed bag. Anyway, let's go into making this scene look calm and ideal. So there's 2 color schemes that I think are particularly useful for this one. There's the water scheme and there's the sort of nature scheme, and both of those just sort of the greens and blues. They can mean different things depending on their tones or gradients. So I'm just going to go to our directional light. I'm going to bring you back to white. Immediately we're back to mostly normal. Our camera we're leaving alone. What else did I do? I added a whole bunch of point lights to the scene. Goodbye point lights. Finally, we had fog, which I'll take off, and then our skybox. I'm just going to duplicate the original skybox again, and I'll just drop that one in here. So one of the sort of hallmarks of doing these kinds of calming spaces is they do tend to abuse the bloom quite a lot. So this is already kind of there. It's got the right colors in place. Let's make this look a little bit more fantasy-like, a little bit more... I guess we want to go with semi-natural, calming, so forth tones. We're going to do that through color grading. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up a couple of the colors. We're going to actually go towards the more pastel-y, innocent colors that I was talking about before. There's a couple of ways we can do this. One of the easier ways is to add an overlay. Unfortunately, the overlays are a little bit difficult to do with the plain stack. But what we can do is I think we can do this through so I'm going to take this toe off. I think if I change the gamma, I can brighten things up to start with, and then I'll use a shoulder to lower that down. Sort of blow this out a bit, but next I'm probably going to lift some of the... Actually, I can do it with lifts, I think. I can indeed. So let's go down somewhere around here. But I might even switch that back to neutral, just neutral, and use maybe a little bit more lift. That is in fact the right way to do it. So we've done that that shift. That, I mean, this will give us some kinds of influences. One thing also just to keep in mind when you're doing these color grading effects, dropping a player character into the scene can be a useful way of color grading how particular skin tones are affected. So for instance, if I drop that on there, we've got some idea of how this looks. So let me just try and line something up with all the particular important bits in the scene. So this is going to influence that. I'm going to... I just realized I've been modifying the wrong post zone. Oh well. What I'll do is I'll just uncheck the lift and I'll move it into the other zone that we've been playing with. This one. I'm going to take our contrast off and I'm going to add our lift back in. So I'm just going to increase our lift, but I'm going to tint it. Tint a bit, and it's a little bit too much, so we'll go there. Right. The next thing we'll do is we'll probably add a little bit more bloom. So if I just go into the effects, bloom is the effect of light bouncing around in the camera. We've talked about it many times before. There is already quite a bit of bloom in this scene. This one is a bit more naturally oriented. I'm going to go towards the slightly more surreal edge. So I've got our bloom here. I've got all of our bits and pieces. I'm going to set the intensity of this up, so you can sort of really begin to see this. And then lower the threshold. Now, lowering the threshold will make everything bloom. The threshold basically indicates what colors bloom. In HDR, it's colors over sort of 1.0. I might tint this bloom as well. So pretty straightforward process. Now, the next one I wanted to actually play around with, and this one was one I wanted to get, was actually working with the volumetric light system and actually showing off what that can do for color grading. If you've been to Zone 54B, which is one of my old regions, you will have seen the quite strong volumetrics in there. That's achieved through the volumetric light system. So if you go to the directional light, we can add a component called volumetric light. Now, unfortunately, we have to preview this in play mode. So to get your pre-brewing running, you still need the volumetric light renderer sitting in there. I'm gonna just try and get a good view on this one, and I'm gonna find our directional light, and I'm gonna add a volumetric light renderer to it. I'm gonna do this at runtime just because of the fact it'll be easier to do. Okay, So, volumetric light. Instantly you can see that's got a very big effect. Volumetric light basically fills the scene or floods the scene with volumetric effects. It'll be easier to see when we've got an area that's not lit versus an area that is lit. So for instance, this light shaft here. Volumetric light effectively simulates the effect of fog and light interacting with each other. So small dust particles, those kinds of things will trip up a volumetric light system. As I increase the intensity, it's one, it is bouncing around the scene, but two, we do get that nice effect there. And as we drop objects into that curve, you'll see they behave in a particularly nice way. So if I just grab a sphere, and I'm going to drop my sphere into here. We should be able to sort of see the shadow of it passing through the volumetric there. Now we can change a few of these effects on the directional light in order to achieve particular goals. For example, we can set this to only affect the ground. Easiest way out here. Let's say we only want the volumetric light to affect the ground layer, so we've got a bit of a fogging going on. We can click the height fog button, and then we can set the scale to influence how much of the fog. As you can see, this is now only going to hit the ground, and we can offset the ground value. We can even use negative values in order to achieve particular results on this. We can add noise. Noise is basically a way of adding sort of smoky effects to it. So if I set just need to get the intensity up high enough, and the scale visible. Also need to fiddle with this a little bit before it actually is shown. I might just boost the overall intensity as well. So we can change some of these things like scattering coefficients, which define how sort of off the thing is. There's also a skybox extinction coefficient, which indicates how much of the skybox is affected by it. If I again grab the camera, look here, and just switch back to my directional light. Doesn't have a lot of influence over this scene. Various scattering. So I'm just going to try and find a way to get the fog visible. Sorry, the scale visible. So this can be used to simulate sort of wind motions, for example. As you can see here, I don't know how well the stream is coming through, but we do have that fog transitioning over. Finally, there's settings for max ray length and so forth. They're just performance settings. The other one just to consider is from a performance perspective, the sample count. Jacking up the sample count to high values will have an impact depending on how large the light area is. So a directional light which has infinite area will actually have performance degradations as you begin to bring the sample count up, whereas a small spotlight may not. So for example, let's grab a spotlight, in fact. I'm going to shine it on this thing here. Let's set shadows on. Add a volumetric light. I'm going to increase the sample count and probably the intensity until it's actually, so you can see this fog beam we've got here now. That is quite bright. But let me just take camera into here. Now the sample count will actually show the quality and the amount of noise on the volumetric light. The good thing is that anti-aliasing takes care of about 99% of this. So it's useful if we lower the sample count. This one's currently set to 22. In fact, because I've got such good anti-aliasing on, even lowering it down to 1 doesn't seem to be adding too much noise. I can see some, but I suspect it won't survive the compression too much. You can see the effect around here in particular of my cursor. I don't know if that is coming through or not, but it sort of looks like JPEG artifacting. Even increasing the sample count to 8 is enough to erase that completely. So you generally don't need to sit on the upper end of the spectrum. It does look a little bit better, but preferably I think it's worth saving the saving performance and giving your users graphics cards a break. So various other parameters and things we can play with, but this one is mostly useful for, I find, full screen effects. Now the localized effects is great, but the full screen ones, or the full scene ones, the most interesting. So I can, for example, if I change the time of day and move the sun over there, which has instantly made a nice change on the scene too, we can actually see the light coming through the trees. If you use the old template region, you would have known that there actually was a similar effect in there. So again, we can play around some of these scattering coefficients and so forth to sort of force more rays in. So we are seeing a couple of sampling issues there. So sampling issues are more likely to appear on higher area lights. That is to say, the ones that are not directional lights. They're not not spotlights and point lights. The directional lights and other really big light sources. So I guess a really large spotlight could have the same impact. In that case, yes, you may want to consider jacking up the count a little bit. We do have some influence on the noise here, so I'm just going to turn that off. So this again can be useful from a thematic storytelling perspective. If we want to, for example, tell a story that has a bit of passion to it, or we really want to sort of bring in these red tones, one of the great ways of doing this one is to actually desaturate the scene entirely except for the reds. And we can do that through the post zone that we've already got. What we do is I'm just going to take these settings off, and we're going to increase our contrast a bit because I think the contrast helps here. And the next right, so I want to desaturate, so that's saturation. This is sort of starting to get there, but the best way to do this is just to desaturate the other colors. And we do this through the grading curve, so I can go to hue versus saturation. It means that the hues controls the amount of saturation. And click override, and then I can start adding keys. So I need to get a key down to 0.5 first. So if you can see, there's two numbers that have now appeared in the control, and we've got to get this to 5.0. So the first one is the position, the x coordinate, and then that's the y coordinate. I just like to get one at 0.5 because that's neutral. And then what we do is we start adding barrier keyframes. So I just add one there, add another one there, another one there, another one there. I'm actually not editing these. These are actually to guard against what I'm about to do, which is go here. I can bring up the saturation of everything. What I can also do is just take some of these ones down. In fact, that's what I should have been doing. Remove a few of those. So I'm not sure what you're set to. You're set to 118, so I'm just going to bring you down to similarly about 118. And there we go. The only thing in the scene right now is the reds. There is a little bit of other color influence. So if you're looking for that effect that Spielberg used in Schindler's List with the red dress, you can do that effect here too. You can isolate particular colors. Just be aware that the sharper the curve you got, the more posterized the effect will be. That is to say, we'll see more of the. So I had a key at on curves here. I'll just bring you up to there, just so we can sort of isolate those colors. To get this to work best, I think it's going to have to be darker on the other areas as well, and we can do a bit of that through just the plain mixing and so forth. The other way you can play with this is changing the exposure on the camera. So we can reduce the exposure except where we need it to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tint the overall scene a little bit as well. I think the direction light might actually do that if we ramp up the intensity. So here we go. We've got something that's sort of very moody, a little bit passionate, but thing we have to be just careful about when we use heavy grading like this is that it does impact on characters. There's a couple of ways we can get around this problem of how we do character lighting. One of them is with player-only light sources. So what I can do is I can add a new directional light to the scene. As you can see here, this is lighting the character a little bit. I'm going to potentially do it like that, just so it gets a good set of angles. I'll follow the sun a bit, just for consistency's sake. It's not completely, it's actually a little bit off the angle. What we can do is we can set the culling mask, and right now the light is affecting everything. If I set it to nothing, we're done there. But we can set it to player, we can set it to avatars. Those two are the important little player layers, and I'm just going to move my preview object to those layers as well. I'm going to set it to player, and suddenly we have a light that only influences players. So if we want players to get that red lighting effect, we can do that too. That does appear like this is actually influencing the GI, so you have to be a little bit careful when using this with Enlighten, as it is going to give us some problems. But still, as you can see here, we can do that. And in theory, if I switch off the real-time lighting, which I might regret doing, but we've got only a couple of minutes to go, so if I lose that, we lose it. As you can see now, we've got a light that is actually only influencing on the player alone. So just the player is affected by this light. Useful, as I said, for making sure that your players stand out in your own particular environment, regardless of whatever monkeying around you're doing with the rest of the scene. Be aware that will cause your character to potentially stand out. I think we can do shadowing against the rest of the scene, though. No, we can't. So just be aware that the shadows on that will not impact on the actual scene. It'll only self-shadow on the character. Again, might be useful depending on what you're doing, but it's probably not. So I'm just going to turn that back on. I'm going to knock out this one. So, final things that are worth showing off is this teal-orange gradient that's used particularly a lot in film. You can create your own. The easiest way is to do this again. We're just going to edit our post stack, or post zone. I'm going to reduce or return our directional light back to normality. Going to take our color grading off, so I just click the reset button, and I'm going to pull all my exposure settings back to normal. Again, we do find that this particular grade does rely heavily on it does rely heavily on the high contrast, but I'm just going to add the key on. Okay, add key on curve. So this particular curve does tend to focus on teal and orange. So the areas around here, the areas around here, and these are the areas that we want to accentuate. So I'll just add key on curves, add key on curves. Let's add a new key in the middle. New key in the middle. I'm just going to hold down. Okay. So I'm going to bring that one up. And I've done it on the wrong curve. I should be doing this on hue versus saturation. Sorry. You out of my way, please. I said it would select the right curve. There we go. So this particular curve is used a lot in film. Now we're going to need to just adjust this a little bit. It does tend to lower the saturation of other areas by a bit. I'm just going to set these down to there. If you looked at movie posters recently, they do tend to pretty heavily dominate themselves, and they also use a bit more of the orange. So I'm just going to widen that one, add a key on curves, and I'll just try and flatten this out a bit. I might just lift some of these. burned out my saturation. I think I've done that because I've ramped up the intensity of the directional light by a lot. I seem to remember playing with that. I've probably also done something else. Likely, yes. Probably need a little more orange in here. So I just have to play an eyeball with many of these things. The last thing that I actually will show a little bit, just if you have used filmic color grading tools in the past, such as the ability to actually look at monitors, there is an option sitting on here, and it is hidden, to view a monitor, and I think it might be on the camera itself that there's an option here. Yes, there's a toolkit. It has moved. I did show this off in the previous version, but unfortunately it looks like Unity have moved it somewhere that I can't quite easily spot. It was here. Okay, so that's probably one of the last things that I'm going to cover off today. The very last thing I will cover before we close off is just the ability to use some custom post effects. If they're compatible with the PostStack v2, they are a good candidate for us to add whitelisting support. Thankfully, post-stack effects generally are nice and self-contained. They don't break too much in the way of the rest of the graphics stack. So we do have one pack that we support. That is the SC post effects support. It does have a lot of nice particular settings for stylized design, such as the Kuwahara filter, which produces a hand-painted effect. So as you can see on here, we can actually play with many of these effects to get weird and wonderful results in our scene. Only downside to this one is obviously that the more stylized the effect, the more likely you are to actually break out your avatar. I would say these effects are more useful when building custom photos filters, which actually is, I think, the topic of next week's class. I need to be 100% sure on that, but it is coming up fairly soon. So just be aware that some of these effects and things are available to use as well. You don't have to restrict yourself just to the Unity built-in ones. However, the Unity built-in ones are quite powerful, and there is quite a lot of effects and things you can do with them. So with that said, I think I will probably finish today because I'm right now on the hour. But I look forward to continuing the class series next week with more on whatever it is, but I think it's snapshot filters, which will also be another fun one to do because it builds off a lot of the stuff we've been playing with the post effects today, except we're going to have to start discussing how to actually bring post into other people's regions safely in a way that will actually get you consistently good results. And the key to that one is override only what you need to, but we'll go into that more next week. All right, thank you all for watching, and I look forward to continuing this series next week.